It was a late afternoon, soaked in the dull, unhurried light that only Oxford seems to possess. A kind of half-hearted gold that trembles before it fades into rain. I had wandered into the King's Pint out of habit more than desire. The place had been there since Cromwell, or so the landlord liked to claim, and smelled of malt, wet coats, and a sadness I found oddly companionable. The low beams sagged like the backs of tired scholars. Beneath the gaslight, smoke drifted in weary spirals that made halos of ordinary things. A glass, a pewter tap, the corner of a newspaper damp with ring marks. I sat with a pint of Abingdon ale, watching the bubbles rise like thoughts that never quite surfaced. A porter from one of the smaller colleges, St. Aldates, I think, was leaning at the bar, reciting a psalm as if it were an anecdote. His voice had that half-drunk eloquence men acquire when they are just sober enough to mean what they say. "Forgive me, for I have forgotten," he murmured, and the words struck me as slightly wrong, though I couldn't immediately say why. It should have been forsaken. The difference seemed trivial, yet it clung to me like the scent of tobacco in my coat. Outside, the bells of Magdalen drifted across the rooftops, half smothered by drizzle. I remember thinking that time in Oxford never moved forward. It merely rearranged itself into familiar disguises. Somewhere beyond the window, undergraduates were laughing too loudly, and the porter was telling anyone who would listen that his college was cursed by generosity. I asked him what he meant, and he smiled with that secrecy particular to men who clean the rooms of the dead. He said that St. Aldates had inherited something it was not meant to keep, and that certain papers had gone missing from the archives. Then he laughed, as though to lighten his own superstition, and drained the rest of his pint. It was nearly dark when I left. Rain fell in disciplined lines, tapping against the bonnet of my car with a monastic rhythm. Lewis had telephoned earlier, reminding me that I still hadn't completed the paperwork on the Newton case. I told him to go home and make peace with his wife, an act of mercy I rarely granted myself. By the time I reached my flat, I'd forgotten the psalm and the porter, or thought I had. But Oxford has a way of bringing things back. The next morning, I was summoned to St. Aldates. A young don named Dr. Simon Kersey had been found dead in his room hanging, apparently, from a beam that had been painted over too often. The porter who discovered him was the same man from the alehouse, his face now pale with the shock of being right about something he had never meant seriously. The coroner was already muttering about suicide, and Lewis was pacing, trying to appear untroubled by the sight. The room smelled of ink and scotch and stale air. A record had finished playing on the turntable, the needle tracing silence. On the desk lay a single sheet of paper. The note read simply, "Forgive me, for I have forgotten." It should have read "Forsaken." The difference pricked at me again, small, pedantic, but insistent. People do not misquote scripture unless they mean to, and this one had chosen his word with care. Forgotten implied something else, an omission, perhaps deliberate, perhaps divine. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the faint hum of electricity and the rain brushing the leaded windows. Lewis asked if I thought it was suicide. I told him I wasn't sure. The light from the desk lamp trembled against the walls like something alive. On the edge of the blotter sat a pint glass, half-washed, faintly rimmed with ale. It carried the ghost of smoke, not from a cigarette, but something older, almost ecclesiastical. My hand hovered above it, feeling the cool of glass that shouldn't have been there. I looked toward the open window, where the curtains swayed slightly despite the still air. Beyond, the spire of St. Aldates pierced a sky the color of pewter. There, amid the quiet and the smell of rain, I understood that the psalm had not followed me by chance. The morning after Kersey's death, the color of parchment was left too long in a drawer, brittle, yellowed, slightly ashamed of being seen. Lewis drove, as he always did, his silence as careful as his turns. I stared out at the rain-slicked cobbles of St. Aldates and thought how Oxford, for all its learning, never quite learned to hide its ghosts. The porter, the same one from the alehouse, hovered at the gate lodge when we arrived, his cap in his hands, as though bareheadedness might make grief more convincing. Kersey's rooms were on the second floor, overlooking the quad rooms of a man who had collected knowledge the way others collect alibis. The faint smell of ink and stale wine hung over everything. On the mantelpiece, a cracked record of Tosca leaned against a stack of exam papers, and beside it, a whiskey glass still wore the soft print of someone's thumb. Nothing in the scene cried violence. That was what unsettled me most. The quiet was too obedient. Lewis stood by the desk, turning the note over in his hand, as if its weight might tell him something. He said it matched the handwriting samples the bursar had shown him, neat, deliberate, even elegant. I said people often imitate themselves when they want to be believed. He looked at me with the patience of a man who has long ceased to argue with puzzles that wear tweed jackets. I noticed then that the diary on the bedside table was missing its final page. A small tear in the binding showed where it had been removed. The pen on the desk was black, the note written in blue. Minor details, easily dismissed by those who prefer neat endings. But I have never trusted neatness. It is the enemy of truth. Lewis asked if I'd like him to search for any signs of forced entry. I told him the only thing forced here was the narrative we were expected to believe. He frowned and said, almost apologetically, that the coroner had already suggested despair, pressure of work, loneliness. I told him that loneliness does not usually carry the scent of alehouse smoke, and that Kersey, if I remembered correctly, was not a man who drank alone. The porter confirmed it. The night before, Kersey had visited the King's Pint. He'd been seen talking with an elegant woman, he said, but not young, perhaps another academic. They had sat in the corner under the stained glass window, where the smoke gathers like confession. When she left, Kersey had remained, staring at his untouched second pint. The porter remembered it because the glass still bore her lipstick, faintly maroon, wiped once and then forgotten. I jotted the details in my notebook, more to quiet my thoughts than from need. Lipstick is a kind of evidence that evaporates in daylight, too personal, too easily denied. Yet it lingers longer in memory than blood. Before leaving the rooms, I opened the window wider. The rain had paused, and the air that entered smelled faintly of moss and something burnt the college furnace perhaps, or the faint ghost of the cigarette someone had smoked here after he was gone. Beneath the sill, a small scrap of paper fluttered loose a corner of the Times crossword, smudged and incomplete. The last filled entry read, "Testament clue words left behind." Lewis called from the door, asking if I was ready. I pocketed the scrap and told him yes. He glanced once more at the beam above, the one that had carried the weight of another man's conclusion, and shook his head. As we crossed the quad, the chapel bell tolled the hour with mechanical precision. Somewhere inside, the chaplain rehearsed his eulogy, already crafting mercy into syntax. I thought of Kersey's unfinished crossword and of the Psalm's misused word. Forgotten, not forsaken. The two were not the same. One implies neglect the other, intent. It occurred to me, as we stepped back into the wet Oxford air, that Simon Kersey had not vanished once, but twice once from life, and once, perhaps, from his own story. The river had that quiet, watchful quality it acquired in late spring. Broad, unhurried, the surface broken only by the reflections of willows leaning too far toward their own likeness. Lewis said she lived nearby, in one of those elegant Georgian terraces that looked as though they had been designed for women who never forgot to close the curtains. Her name was Dr. Margaret Leighton Classics, if I remembered correctly, and her reputation among her peers was for precision, not warmth. I found her sitting by the window, marking papers with the concentration of someone defending herself from thought. She looked up as I entered, her expression polite. the faintest shadow of irritation behind it. I introduced myself, and she smiled in the professional way of those accustomed to interruptions. When I mentioned Kersey, the smile faltered. She asked if it was necessary to revisit Payne so soon. I told her it was seldom convenient and never soon enough. Her sitting room smelled faintly of lilies and ink. The shelves were immaculate, not a spine out of order, the sort of discipline that, in my experience, conceals exhaustion. She said she had known Kersey since his postgraduate days, and that they had collaborated briefly on a paper concerning Augustine's idea of moral amnesia. I noted the phrase silently, moral amnesia, and asked if that had been his state of mind when she last saw him. She paused too long, then said they had met by the river 2 nights before his death. He had asked her for advice about something personal, something he claimed was weighing on his conscience. She did not elaborate. When pressed, she said it was about a discovery of a document, perhaps though she could not recall its nature. Her hand, steady until then, trembled slightly as she set down her pen. I told her Kersey's diary was missing its final page, and that a torn scrap of crossword had been found near his desk. She said that meant little. He was forever scribbling puzzles, quoting things out of context. She added, almost absently, that he liked to test her with misquotations, a game between them, a private joke. I asked for an example. She hesitated, then said that once he had altered a verse from the Psalms to prove how easily people overlook what they expect to see. Forgotten instead of forsaken. I could not help but notice the small shiver in her tone when she spoke the word. Through the window, the river glinted dully, moving like the mind does when it wants to escape itself. I told her the porter at St. Aldates had seen her with Kersey at the King's Pint. She did not deny it. She said they had gone there after walking along the towpath, that Kersey wanted somewhere quiet to think. He had been frightened, she said, though, of what, she could not say. He spoke of a letter, of someone who knew what he had done. When I asked what that might have been, she said nothing for a long while, only watched the water as though it might offer a reflection worth trusting. Lewis stood awkwardly by the door, tapping the edge of his notebook. She turned to him then, as if seeking permission to stop pretending. I asked if she had loved Kersey. She replied that love is too generous a word for most of what passes for it at Oxford. But yes, once, perhaps, long ago. And no, not recently. She said the past with him had been something like Greek tragedy poorly staged, but still inevitable. When we left, the sky was lowering, pale and swollen with unshed rain. I walked to the river bank and stood where she said they had spoken. The footprints in the mud were faint, almost erased by wind. A torn leaflet from a local concert floated in the shallows, its ink blurred into abstract sorrow. I thought again of the crossword clue testament of fire, found in smoke, and it occurred to me that what we call discovery is often only the unearthing of something we had already tried to bury. Lewis asked if I believed her. I said I believed everything except her choice of words. He frowned, waiting for elaboration, but I offered none. Some truths prefer their own silence. We watched a boat drift past, oars creaking like old prayers, and as the first drops of rain began to fall, I realized that whatever had passed between Kersey and the woman by the river had not ended in the water, but had merely changed its current. There are evenings in Oxford that smell faintly of old paper and lost time. The air thickens in quadrangles, and the lamps, burning behind glass, take on the hue of old sherry. That night, St. Aldates held its annual Founders' Dinner, a ceremony of roasted lamb, port, and conscience. I had not been invited, but I went anyway. The college secretary, a thin man with an ecclesiastical stoop, assured me that my presence would not disturb the solemnity, though it clearly did. The high table glittered beneath portraits of the forgotten rich. Latin mottos stared down from the cornices, the dead whispering their conditional benevolence to scholarship, to discipline, to secrecy. The dons spoke in low tones about the weather, the bursar's gout, the new library extension. Between courses, I caught the eye of Reverend Bain, who smiled with an oiliness that no amount of faith could absolve. He raised his glass toward me, a gesture meant to appear harmless. Kersey's widow sat 2 seats away, wearing an expression of gentle disbelief, as if her husband's death had been announced too early. The wine had loosened her posture, but not her restraint. She spoke little, yet her silence drew glances. I wondered if grief, like certain wines, improved with distance. Lewis, seated beside the bursar, was visibly restless, tugging at his collar. He hated these dinners, the silver, the Latin, the faint air of hypocrisy. I, on the other hand, found them instructive. One learns more from the way a man refills his glass than from what he says. When the port was passed round, I noticed that Bain's hand trembled as he poured, not from age, from fear. The decanter rattled softly against the rim. He turned to Dr. Hadley, the historian, said something about the college's archives being a treasure too fragile to be disturbed. Hadley laughed too quickly, too loudly. That was when I knew something in the archives had already been disturbed. After dinner, in the smoking room, the conversation turned inevitably to Kersey. Hadley called him brilliant but misguided. The chaplain murmured something about the wages of pride. The widow excused herself, her chair sighing in relief. Bain lit a cigarette and said that faith, properly understood, can bear even the worst of shames. It was a sentence rehearsed, crafted for the comfort of others. I asked if Kersey had mentioned anything unusual in the days before his death. Bain's eyes drifted toward the fire. He said the man had been agitated, as though struggling with an impossible choice. He used the phrase moral inheritance. Then, as if regretting the slip, he changed the subject to the scarcity of good ports in England since the 70s. Later, as the college clock struck 11, I slipped away to the fellow's cellar. It was partly curiosity, partly instinct. The air was cool, scented faintly with cork and stone. On a wooden rack stood a dozen bottles of St. Emilia, their labels yellowing like secrets left too long unspoken. One bottle was newer, its dust disturbed. Someone had been here recently. I picked it up. The cork had been pressed back in with unsteady fingers. Inside, folded tightly against the glass, was a torn piece of parchment, a note or document fragment, damp with wine. I held it up to the weak light. A phrase emerged from the private testament by hand, not for public reading. I replaced the bottle and left as quietly as I'd come. Outside, the night rain had begun again, stippling the cobbles with small, perfect ellipses. Lewis waited by the gate, his patience cloaked in cigarette smoke. He asked if I had found anything. I said, only evidence that truth ferments better than wine. He looked puzzled, but said nothing. As we walked toward the car, the bells of Magdalen began to toll midnight slowly, deliberately, each chime echoing through the damp air like the turning of a page. I thought of Kersey again, of the missing page in his diary, the fragment of will, the fear that clung to Bain's fingers like candle wax. The college, with all its polite Latin and silvered restraint, had been fermenting a secret for years, perhaps decades. The past never really dies in Oxford. It merely decants itself into new bottles, waiting for someone foolish enough to taste it. There are certain mornings in Oxford when the fog seems to come from the stone itself, a slow exhalation of centuries, unwilling to reveal what it remembers. That morning was one of them. The quadrangle of St. Aldates lay beneath a veil so thick it rendered everything both intimate and uncertain. It suited the mood of the case, and perhaps my own. Lewis and I met with the bursar, an anemic man who regarded every question as an audit. He led us through a corridor lined with oil portraits that glistened faintly with condensation. Somewhere behind those painted eyes, I imagined a long tradition of discretion, of papers quietly vanished, of benefactors' sins politely forgotten. The bursar unlocked a small archive room and gestured toward an empty space in a wooden drawer. The label, faded but legible, read Private Testament Property of St. Aldates College. He explained with bureaucratic serenity that the document had gone missing sometime in the past week. It had been removed by Dr. Kersey for research purposes and not returned. His tone suggested that loss was merely another form of order. I examined the edges of the drawer for faint scratches recently. Someone had forced it, but gently, with familiarity. I asked if anyone else possessed a key. He hesitated before admitting that Reverend Bain, as college chaplain, had access for pastoral reasons. Lewis raised an eyebrow. I said nothing, though inwardly the words settled like dust on an old suspicion. The bursar recited the story of the will in the careful cadence of a man repeating a myth he no longer believes. It had been written in 1882 by Sir Henry Quinton, a theologian of considerable wealth and questionable virtue. He had left a sum intended to establish a scholarship for students of modest birth and good Latin, but the funds had never been distributed. The conditions of the bequest were obscure, and it seemed deliberately so. There was mention of a sealed letter to be opened only when the family shame was at rest. Whatever that meant, the college had chosen not to interpret it. Lewis called it a ghost scholarship, which made the bursar wince. I asked whether Kersey had discovered anything new about it. The bursar replied that he had been troubling the peace of the archives, an oddly ecclesiastical phrase. Kersey had spoken to both Bain and Dr. Layton, though the content of those conversations was unclear. I left the archive with a photocopy of the index page, the words Private Testament printed beside a red X. The fog outside had thickened, swallowing the chapel spire. I stood for a moment, listening to the slow drip of water from the gutters. The sound reminded me of a clock marking time it had already lost. Lewis suggested lunch. Instead, I asked him to walk with me to the furnace room, a curious impulse, but I've long trusted that. The door was locked, but the caretaker, eager to be useful, fetched his keys. Inside, the air was heavy with soot and something faintly metallic. Among the ashes, half concealed, lay a bundle of charred paper. I lifted it carefully. The outer pages were blackened beyond recovery, but the inner fragment bore a surviving phrase codicil enclosed herewith, to be revealed in due discretion. The edges were singed, but the handwriting was strong 19th-century copperplate, the kind used by those who feared their words might be misread by eternity. Lewis watched as I turned the paper toward the light. He said it looked like Kersey's doing, that perhaps he'd tried to destroy the evidence once he'd realized its implications. I told him it was possible, but unlikely. The burning was too cautious, too deliberate, not destruction concealment. Someone had tried to make the disappearance appear accidental. I folded the fragment into my notebook. The fog had begun to lift as we stepped outside, revealing the faint outline of the chapel door. Bain stood there, speaking to a student. His hand rested on the boy's shoulder with an intimacy that felt practiced. When he saw me, he smiled, though it failed to reach his eyes. I've never much cared for men who smile in fog. Later that evening, alone with a glass of wine that had long since lost its nerve, I examined the fragment again. The ink had bled, slightly, forming a faint halo around each letter. It was beautiful in its decay, like something written not to be read, but to be found. Somewhere in its phrasing to be revealed in due discretion, I sensed the shape of a bargain, the sort made between guilt and God, or perhaps between colleagues who knew too much about one another. I remember thinking then that Kersey's death had nothing to do with despair, and everything to do with discretion. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the sort that makes even the river look tired. The air was heavy with drizzle, and the sky over St. Aldates hung like an old curtain. Lewis and I were in the chapel, waiting for the choir rehearsal to finish. The organ murmured through scales that sounded more penitential than melodic. There is something about church music that sharpens the edges of guilt. Perhaps that is its true purpose. I have never cared much for organized piety, but I have always respected its architecture. The carved stalls, the candle smoke, the faint musk of hymnals left open too long, these things hold their own kind of truth. When the last note fell into silence, I asked Lewis to have a word with the choir master while I lingered near the front pews. It was there, beneath the lectern, that I saw a small black hymnal, its cover warped by damp. The book had been left open at Psalm 39. Beneath the printed verses, 2 sets of initials were written in pencil, SK and ML, joined by a faint stroke, a human impulse toward connection. Below them, in smaller script, the phrase, "Forgive me, for I have forgotten." The same words as in Kersey's note. The handwriting, unmistakably, was his. I thought again of Dr. Layton, her calm precision, the tremor in her hand when she mentioned the psalm. It was not religion that tied her to this verse, but memory. The act of remembering someone she had long since abandoned, or perhaps someone who had abandoned her. Lewis returned, saying the choir master knew nothing. He added that Reverend Bain had conducted the last evensong before Kersey's death, and that Kersey himself had been in attendance. The Reverend, Lewis said, had chosen the psalm. I told him to find out how many times Bain had used that same psalm in his sermons. He looked puzzled, as he often did when the logic was more emotional than procedural. We left the chapel and followed the sound of choir boys laughing in the cloister. I envied their innocence, though innocence in Oxford, like honesty, is usually borrowed rather than earned. The sky had cleared slightly, revealing a sliver of pale light that fell across the old stone floor. It caught on something metallic, a tuning fork left behind on a step. I picked it up, struck it softly against my palm. The note it produced lingered a pure, trembling A, steady and incorruptible. I thought of truth as something that begins the same way, clear, simple, but too easily drowned by harmony. Later that evening, Lewis and I called Bain at his room. He was alone, seated by a fire that seemed too large for the weather. His study smelled of incense and old sermons. He greeted us warmly, too warmly, and offered sherry. I declined. Lewis, ever polite, accepted. The Reverend spoke at length about Kersey, a troubled soul, a man at war with himself, the kind of intellectual, he said, who mistook despair for depth. While he spoke, I studied the bookshelves. The second row was immaculate save for one gap in a missing volume of the Book of Common Prayer. I asked if he lent it out. He said perhaps to a student in need of guidance. The hesitation was slight, but present. His eyes flickered toward the hearth. We left soon after. Outside, the chapel bells were ringing for compline, their sound low and mournful. Lewis asked what I thought of Bain. I told him the Reverend had lied, though perhaps not consciously. He asked how I could tell, because, I said, he reached for the word soul when he meant reputation. Back at my flat, I poured myself a whiskey and unfolded the scrap of parchment from the burned testament. The phrase in due discretion had begun to fade. I traced the letters with my finger and thought of how easily faith can become currency traded, misused, forgotten. Then I opened my crossword. One of the clues read, "He sings of faith but fears the silence for." I filled it in almost without thinking. Bain. It fit perfectly. And yet, as I set down the pencil, I wasn't sure if I had solved anything at all or merely translated guilt into a language I understood. Memory, I've often thought, is the most unreliable witness. It blinks, reshapes, redeems, condemns often within the same recollection. That thought occurred to me as I sat once again in the King's Pint. The same table, the same uneven floorboard beneath my shoe. The air smelled of malt and rain-damp wool, and the stained-glass window still glowed faintly like a confession reluctant to fade. The barmaid, a woman with the kind of face that remembers too much, recognized me immediately. She said I looked like someone who had lost his place in a story. I told her that was not inaccurate. I asked about the night Dr. Kersey came in, the one that ended badly. Her memory came in fragments, like a page torn from two different books. She remembered him arriving early, ordering a pint of bitter. He'd taken the corner seat, the one under the cracked portrait of the bishop. A woman joined him later. Dark hair, deliberate posture, the kind of elegance that doesn't seek permission. Dr. Layton, I thought. But the barmaid said something that unsettled me. There had been 2 glasses, one full, one half empty, but when she cleared the table, there were traces of lipstick on both. I asked if she was sure. She was. The color had been dark plum and slightly smudged. I could almost see Layton's hand lifting to her mouth, the gesture precise, habitual. But if both glasses bore the same imprint, there would have been no second drinker, only the illusion of one. The pint of false memory. Lewis, sitting beside me, stirred his tea with the care of a man measuring patience. He said it could be the barmaid's imagination. I said imagination was a better recorder of truth than fact. He sighed a sound I'd come to associate with his quiet surrender. I asked her if anyone else had spoken with Kersey that night. She frowned. A man had entered after the woman left. Someone older, clerical perhaps. She remembered the smell of incense and a voice that said something like, "The matter must be concluded." She couldn't recall his face clearly. The lighting was poor, she said, but she did recall his hand reaching across the table to take something, a folded envelope. We left the pub as dusk began to sink over Oxford, that peculiar hour when even the street lamps seem hesitant. Lewis walked beside me, collar up, the drizzle painting small halos around the lights. He asked if I believed the story. I said I believed the parts she wasn't sure of. Certainty, in my experience, was the first refuge of liars. We crossed the High and turned into the narrow lane that led back toward St. Aldates. The chapel bell tolled 6. I thought again of Bain, his trembling hand at the dinner, his practiced sympathy. The barmaid's description fit him well enough. A man accustomed to borrowed authority, to speaking softly in order to be believed. Back at the station, I spread the evidence on my desk, the crossword scrap, the burned fragment of the Testament, the note, the hymn book page. Together they looked like a sermon interrupted mid-prayer. Lewis watched me rearrange them. He said it felt like we were chasing ghosts. I told him we were. That was the only kind of truth Oxford ever left behind. I poured us both a drink from the bottle in my drawer, whiskey, not ale. The good kind for reflection. I asked him if he noticed anything about the handwriting on Kersey's note. He shook his head. I pointed out the looped F in forgive, a stroke too ornate for a man who wrote with haste. I'd seen that flourish before in the reverend's signature on the college's visitor register. Lewis said that could mean anything. I said it meant he'd copied something once and gotten used to it. Habit leaves traces, even in ink. The thought lingered with me as I drove home that night. The rain had turned to mist, the city blurred into greys and ghosts. I passed the pub again, the faint light in the window trembling behind the glass, like a memory unwilling to rest. I thought of the 2 pints, both marked by the same mouth, both emptied by the same hand. There was, I realized, a strange mercy in the act of drinking alone. One could at least pretend the silence belonged to someone else. When I reached my flat, I left the light off and sat by the window with my whiskey. I could taste the smoke of the malt, faint, bitter, and clean. Somewhere below, a group of students were singing off-key, but earnestly, a hymn I half recognized from Kersey's funeral service. I caught a single line before the wind took it away. "Forgive me, for I have forgotten." And for the first time I wondered whether Kersey's last words had been a confession at all, or a quotation borrowed from a man who had needed absolution more than he did. The Reverend Bain lived in rooms that smelled of polish and restraint. It was a late afternoon in early October, the kind that made the sky look like an old bruise. Lewis and I stood outside his oak door, listening to the faint rhythm of an organ prelude drifting from within. When he opened the door, the sound died abruptly, as though the room itself had been caught praying without permission. He greeted us with a calm that seemed borrowed. His collar was immaculate, his smile exact. There was a glass of sherry on the table, half finished, and beside it a book of sermons annotated in the neat, slanted hand of someone who feared untidiness more than sin. He invited us to sit, and when I said I preferred to stand, he nodded with the patience of a man who had learned to turn condescension into grace. He began by speaking of Kersey, a troubled man, brilliant but adrift, he said. I listened, watching his hands rather than his words. They were clasped too tightly, knuckles pale against the cassock. I asked whether he had known about Kersey's research into the Quinton Testament. He hesitated not long enough to seem startled, but just long enough to suggest rehearsal. He said Kersey had indeed approached him, seeking moral counsel, though their talk had been more spiritual than scholarly. He added, almost as an afterthought, that Kersey had seemed frightened. Lewis, ever literal, asked what of. Bain smiled thinly and said, of himself, perhaps a man's conscience can be a crueler jailer than the law. It was the sort of phrase that wins pulpits but not trust. I walked to the window. The view overlooked the chapel yard, where the first leaves had begun to fall in uneven drifts. I asked if he remembered the last thing Kersey said to him. The Reverend looked down at his glass, turning it slowly as though searching for a reflection. He said that Kersey had come to his office with an envelope, that he'd spoken of fire and smoke, and of something that must be burned before it was too late. He had tried to dissuade him, Bain said, but the man had been determined. I asked what was in the envelope. He said he never looked. The lie was polite but unconvincing. I noticed a small scorch mark on the edge of his writing desk, circular, deliberate, the kind left by a candle, or perhaps a match. I wondered if the fire Kersey spoke of had begun here. The Reverend followed my gaze and said that his work demanded long hours, that accidents happened. I said accidents seldom leave rings so perfectly round. Lewis shifted beside me, uncomfortable with the silence that followed. Bain broke it by asking if we believed in redemption. I told him belief was never the problem. It was the conditions attached to it. He laughed then, quietly. Though it was not the sound of amusement, it was the sound of a man testing whether irony could pass for sincerity. He said redemption, in his experience, required a witness. Then, almost softly, he added that some confessions were never meant to be heard, only written, then forgotten. I asked whether Kersey's suicide note could have been one of those. He looked at me sharply, then smiled again, the mask reaffixed. I said that the phrasing of the note in the misused psalm mirrored the wording in one of his published sermons. The Reverend said I must have read widely, and I replied that I had merely read carefully. When we left, the air outside felt colder, thinner. Lewis asked if I thought Bain was guilty. I told him guilt was an imprecise word and that some men sinned not by action, but by omission. He frowned, said he didn't follow. I told him he would eventually. That night I returned alone. The chapel was unlocked, the air heavy with candle wax and echo. I sat in the back pew and listened to the last vibrations of the organ's pipes dying into stillness. On the lectern lay Bain's open Bible. A ribbon marked the Gospel of John. Beneath it, folded neatly, was a typed page, a sermon draft titled Testament in Smoke. The ink was fresh. I read the first line before I closed the book. It said, "There are truths too merciful for daylight." I replaced it exactly as I found it. As I walked back through the quad, the lamplight wavered on the wet flagstones, fractured by the drizzle. Somewhere a choir boy was humming what sounded like a psalm, though I couldn't tell which. The words drifted through the dark, reshaped by distance into something almost human. "Forgive me, for I have forgotten." It was Lewis who brought it to me, though he didn't yet understand what he was holding. A single envelope, unremarkable in size and color, sealed with the kind of care that suggests guilt rather than privacy. It had been sent anonymously to the bursar of St. Aldates, posted the morning after Kersey's death. The handwriting was neat but impersonal, the sort of script cultivated by men who fear being known. Inside, the message was brief. "He has done the right thing at last." No signature, no date, though the postmark placed it within 24 hours of the discovery. The bursar, being a man allergic to implication, had handed it to the college porter, who passed it along to the police with the relief of one unburdening a curse. I read it twice. The phrasing was curious, not that he had done the right thing, but at last. The past lingered in those two words, a residue of impatience. Whoever wrote it had waited for this ending. The envelope smelled faintly of tobacco and damp paper. A faint indentation ran across its surface, the ghost of a crossword grid pressed from beneath, as though the letter had been written on the back of a newspaper. I fetched a magnifying glass and angled it under the lamplight. The pattern was clear, the faint outline of squares still visible. I turned to the crossword section of the Times from that date. There it was, the same clue I'd found in Kersey's room, testament of fire, found in smoke. Someone had written the letter in the King's Pint. Lewis watched me with the patience of a man who knows the performance will not include an explanation until the curtain falls. He asked what it meant. I told him it meant the truth was more sociable than we thought. That afternoon, we went back to the alehouse. The air was thick with the residue of fried food and conversation. The barmaid greeted me with that same half-smile, the kind that forgives without understanding. I asked if she'd noticed anyone using the crossword pages that night. She frowned, thinking, then said there had been a woman sitting alone after Kersey left writing, folding something, lighting a cigarette she never finished. Dark hair, steady eyes, no hurry. Dr. Margaret Layton. I thanked her and left, the knowledge settling coldly in my chest. Guilt, I've found, is rarely spontaneous. It needs rehearsal. We drove through the drizzle to Layton's rooms. She let us in without surprise. The house smelled of tea and restraint. Her face was pale, but there was a steadiness about her that spoke of resignation rather than fear. She asked whether it was about Kersey. I told her it always was. She didn't deny writing the letter. She said she had meant it as an act of closure, that she had been fond of him once, but could not forgive what he'd done. When I asked what that was, she said quietly that he had stolen something from her. Not money, not words or ideas. A paper years ago that she had labored over, and that he had published as his own. He had begged forgiveness, she said. He had wanted to set things right, to confess to the college, to destroy the false legacy that had followed him, and I paused and told him to think carefully before ruining what little remained of both of us. Lewis shifted uncomfortably. I asked whether she had met him that final night. She nodded. By the river. He had the testament in his coat, the old will that tied the college's fortune to its shame. He'd wanted to show her, to prove that truth, once unsealed, could heal. She told him not to be naive, that truth was only ever useful to those already safe from it. He had said he would deliver it to Bain. That was the last she saw of him. When we left, I walked slowly along the embankment where they had met. The mist hung low over the water, folding sound and memory together. I stopped beneath a bridge and watched a leaf drift past, fragile, indecisive. In my pocket, the letter weighed more than paper should. There was something deliberate about its tone, something performative. The phrase at last had the cadence of quotation. I searched my memory and found a line from Bain's sermon, published 3 months earlier in the parish journal. We are forgiven when we at last do the right thing, even if too late. So the reverend had been quoting himself, or someone had quoted him. Back at my desk, I unfolded Kersey's suicide note once more. The ink had faded slightly along one edge, blurred by moisture. I noticed now what I had missed before a faint impression, as if another sheet had lain atop it while being written. The words mirrored faintly in reverse. He has done the right thing at last. The letter had not been written after his death. It had been written at the same time, on the same desk, with the same hand guiding both. Whether Bain's or another's, I could not yet say. But one thing was certain: Kersey had not written alone. There are moments, rare and unsought, when the air in Oxford seems to stand still, as if the city itself is holding its breath, waiting for a confession. That evening, the fog rolled across the quad like parchment being unrolled, and I found myself once again at the King's Pint, though not for drink. The place had emptied early. The barman polished a glass in slow circles, the kind of gesture performed by men who know when not to ask questions. I sat where Kersey once had, the corner beneath the painted bishop, and waited. The fire had burned low, a dull orange pulse beneath the grate. Its warmth was insufficient, but oddly companionable. Above it hung a curl of smoke that refused to vanish, shaping itself into small, hesitant spirals, as if memory itself were trying to speak. Bain arrived late. He entered without haste, his coat still buttoned, though the room was warm. He greeted me as a man greets a colleague he no longer wishes to see. I gestured to the chair opposite, and he sat. I told him about the letter, about the handwriting, about the indentation of the crossword grid. He did not feign surprise. Instead, he looked into the fire and said that people often leave behind fragments of themselves, sometimes in ink, sometimes in ash. He poured himself a whiskey without asking, which I admired in a small, bitter way. He said Kersey had been a good man, a misguided man, a man who could not bear the weight of his own revelation. I asked what revelation that might be. Bain smiled weary, priestly, and said that every man reaches a point where he discovers the limits of his virtue. The silence that followed felt heavier than accusation. The crackle of the fire sounded almost indecent in it. I told him I'd found the scorch marks on his desk. He nodded. He said that Kersey had come to him with the will of the private testament, that Kersey had wanted it destroyed to end the cycle of guilt that had chained the college to its past. Bain had agreed. They had prayed together, he said, and then Kersey had left. But later, when he read the psalm, Kersey had quoted, "Forgive me, for I have forgotten." He realized the man meant to destroy something else entirely. I asked if that was why he followed Kersey to his rooms. His fingers tightened on the glass. He said that faith, once lit, burns quickly. Outside, rain began to strike the windows with erratic precision. He spoke then, his voice lower, almost confessional. Kersey had wavered. The will was in his hands, the matchbox beside it. He had asked whether truth could still serve God if it destroyed good men. Bain had said that God was never the one in danger. Then Bain's eyes closed as he said it. The paper caught fire. It burned unevenly, leaving fragments. Kersey had reached to save it, and in the same moment, Bain had tried to stop him. There was no struggle, he said, only misunderstanding. The next words came almost too softly to hear. When it was done, the smoke had already filled the room. He had written the note himself, not to deceive, but to spare the college. The phrase from the psalm had seemed merciful. Forgotten sounded kinder than forsaken. He looked up at me, and for the first time that evening the serenity left his face. He asked if I would call it murder. I told him I no longer trusted the word. The fire had died down to embers. In the silence that followed, I became aware of the faint smell of burning parchment, not from the hearth, but from somewhere deeper in memory. I realized then that Bain's tragedy was not one of guilt, but of faith misplaced in discretion. Oxford had taught him too well how to protect reputations. Lewis arrived a few minutes after Bain left. I handed him the folded letter and told him to keep it safe. He asked if we had enough to charge him. I said no, we had enough to understand him, which is never quite the same thing. That night, as I walked home through the mist, the bells of St. Aldates began to toll, slowly, deliberate, unrepentant. Their sound drifted through the smoke of the chimneys and seemed to dissolve into the night. At my flat, I poured a final measure of whiskey and sat by the window. The crossword from Kersey's desk lay open on the table. I filled in the last unsolved clue Truth revealed through Flame 7, Testament, and for a long while, I watched the word darken in the lamplight, the ink bleeding slowly into the fibers of the page, a small fire of its own. It ended, as such things often do, not with revelation, but with weather. A thin drizzle hung over Oxford that morning, soft and persistent, the kind that dampens thought rather than cloth. The bells of St. Aldates were ringing for morning prayer, though their sound felt less like invitation and more like penance. I stood in the quad, watching the mist unfurl across the lawns, and thought of how little the city changes. Only the faces, and even they repeat themselves if you wait long enough. Bain had been taken quietly. There was no struggle, no spectacle. Lewis said the reverend had walked with the same composure he'd worn behind the pulpit, murmuring something about forgiveness. I did not accompany them. I stayed behind in the chapel, where the faint scent of smoke still lingered. It was there, on the lectern, that I found the folded page from his final sermon, a fragment of a sermon he would never deliver. It read, in the measured hand of a man accustomed to quotation, "There are sins of the flesh and sins of the word. The latter are harder to atone for, because they masquerade as virtue." Lewis joined me later, his coat dripping on the flagstones. He said the file would be closed within a week. Suicide, assisted perhaps, or accident, but tidy enough for the college. I told him tidiness was the last refuge of cowardice. He smiled faintly, used to my contempt for closure. I asked what would happen to Leighton. He said she'd resigned her fellowship and left for Rome, a study grant officially. Exile, in truth. The chapel felt colder as the bells fell silent. I imagined Kersey sitting where I stood, head bowed, the burden of confession mistaken for absolution. There had been a moment, I remembered it clearly now in his diary, in that missing page we never found. A line quoted from Augustine memory is the keeper of sorrow. Perhaps that had been his last act of honesty. Outside, the porter crossed the quad with his broom, sweeping wet leaves into obedient piles. He looked up and nodded to me, a gesture so ordinary it seemed almost holy. I envied him for his work, the simple restoration of order. I've spent my life doing much the same, but the ground never stays clean for long. Lewis and I walked to the King's Pint one final time. The barmaid saw us and poured without asking. She asked if it was all over now. I said nothing, which she took for yes. The fire was unlit, the grate cold. The same portrait of the bishop hung above us, his painted eyes dimmed by centuries of resignation. I thought of Bain's last words in the pub, the quiet certainty with which he said that truth, once kindled, could not be extinguished without consequence. He had been right, in a way that left no one absolved. Lewis talked for a while about retirement, about the countryside, about peace. I let him. When he finished, I told him that peace is merely the absence of sound, not of guilt. He didn't answer. We drank in silence. When I finally left the alehouse, Oxford was already fading into evening. The pavement shone under the lamps, slick with reflected light. Across the street, the chapel windows glowed faintly, as though the city were keeping vigil for itself. The bells began again slower this time, more deliberate. Each note lingered longer than it should have, dissolving into the rain. I walked toward the sound, following it through the narrowing streets until I reached the edge of the college wall. The stone was dark, its surface beaded with water, like the skin of some old creature too tired to shed the weather. I leaned against it and listened. The last bell struck, low and final. For a moment afterward, there was only silence, the pure kind, the kind that empties rather than comforts. Then, faintly, from somewhere beyond the spire, came the echo of another bell, distant, uncertain, out of time. Perhaps it was only the wind. Perhaps it was something left unresolved. I never did learn whether Bain believed in redemption, but I think Kersey did in his way. And maybe that is why the smoke, even now, seems to linger longer in the air above St. Aldates than anywhere else in Oxford.